This 1889 portrait of the teacher and student looks simple until you notice the slate. At first glance, it is exactly what it appears to be, a dignified photograph from a black schoolroom somewhere in the rural South, one of thousands taken in that era. But there is a detail written on that slate that would eventually force a major university archive to confront how many other pieces of evidence they had been misreading for over a century. And it would cost one woman everything. Dr. Angela Winters found the photograph on a Thursday morning in March while cataloging a donation to the Mississippi Historical Society's education collection. She had been doing this work for 11 years. She specialized in visual culture and Reconstruction-era schooling, and she thought she had seen every variation of posed classroom photography from that period. The image showed a black woman in her 30s, dressed in a dark high-necked blouse with careful pleats, sitting beside a girl who looked about 8 or 9. They sat at a small wooden desk. Both looked directly at the camera with expressions that struck Winters as unusually assured, almost defiant. The studio mark on the corner identified it as the work of Isaiah Thorne, a traveling photographer who worked the Delta counties in the late 1880s. Winters adjusted her magnifying lamp and leaned closer. The desk was bare except for one object, a small writing slate, angled slightly toward the camera. On it, in careful cursive, someone had written 3 short sentences. At first, Winters thought it was just a sample of the child's penmanship, the kind of thing proud teachers often included in portraits. But something about the phrasing made her pause. She pulled out her phone and photographed the slate, then enlarged the image on her screen. The sentences read, "I write my name with care. I read from books made for thinking. I will speak as I please." It was not the content alone that stopped her. It was the style, the deliberate phrasing, the emphasis on reading books made for thinking rather than the more common, "I learn my lessons well." She had spent years reading 19th century pedagogical materials, and this felt specific, intentional, like a declaration. She flipped the photograph over. On the back, in faded pencil, was a name. Miss Viola Chandler, spring term, 1889, Bolivar County. Below it, someone had added in different handwriting, much later. Confiscated materials, C-File 47B. Winters felt something shift in her chest. Confiscated. That word did not belong in a simple schoolroom portrait. By the time Winters finished her first week with the photograph, she had learned 3 things. First, Isaiah Thorne's studio records were still partially intact, held by a church archive in Greenwood. Second, Bolivar County had been one of the most tightly controlled regions in Mississippi during the 1880s, with rigid enforcement of new education codes passed in the wake of Reconstruction's collapse. And third, the photograph had been donated to the Historical Society in 1923 by the estate of a white school superintendent named Albert Griggs, along with a box of other materials labeled only as evidence from closed cases. Winters had built her career on being patient and methodical. She did not leap to conclusions. She worked in layers, checking and cross-referencing, always aware that speculation could undermine the credibility of her findings. But she had been doing this long enough to recognize when an image was hiding something deliberate. She had cataloged thousands of photographs from the post-Reconstruction South, stiff family portraits, church gatherings, work crews posed beside cotton bales. Most of them followed predictable patterns. This one did not. She took the photograph out of its archival sleeve and examined the edges under high magnification. There were tiny creases along one side, as if it had been folded and carried. There was also a small round stain near the bottom corner, possibly from a wax seal. Someone had treated this image as a document, not just a keepsake. The more she looked, the more she noticed. The child's hands were positioned carefully on the desk, fingers spread as if to emphasize that she was holding nothing, hiding nothing. The teacher's left hand rested on the back of the child's chair, but her right hand was out of frame. The slate was angled with precision, the writing fully legible, even in a photograph that would have required several seconds of exposure. Winters realized that this image had been staged not for sentimental reasons, but as proof. Proof of what, she could not yet say. But she knew she could not let it go. The Thorne studio records gave her the exact date, April 14, 1889. The sitting had been paid for by Viola Chandler herself, $2 in advance, an unusually large sum for a black teacher in rural Mississippi. The church archive also had a brief register entry noting that Thorne had photographed several educational subjects that spring in the colored district near Rosedale, though most of those images had since been lost or destroyed. Winters contacted a colleague at Jackson State University, Dr. Marcus Webb, who specialized in black education policy during the 1880s and 1890s. She sent him a scan of the slate. Webb called her back within 2 hours. "Do you know what you have?" he asked. She did not. "That phrasing," Webb said, "is from the Freedmen's Literacy Primer, 3rd edition. It was developed by black educators in Virginia in 1885 and circulated through networks of teachers across the South. The Mississippi legislature banned it specifically in 1887, along with about 15 other texts under the Manual Training Act. Schools serving black children were legally required to focus on industrial skills, woodwork, sewing, agriculture. Academic literacy was classified as inflammatory." Winters wrote this down carefully, so if a teacher was caught using this primer, arrest, Webb said, closure of the school, confiscation of materials. There are documented cases of teachers being charged with inciting disorder. Some were fined. A few were jailed. It was part of a broader effort to make sure that black education stayed in a very narrow lane. You could teach children to read instructions and sign their names, but you could not teach them to read critically, to write persuasively, or to think independently. That was the line, and it was enforced. Winters felt the weight of the photograph shift in her mind. This was not a proud teacher posing with a student. This was evidence of a crime, or evidence of resistance, or both. She went back to the archive and requested File 47B. It took 3 days for the file to be retrieved from deep storage. When it arrived, Winters opened it in a small research room on the 3rd floor of the Historical Society building, alone except for the archive assistant who had wheeled in the box on a cart. Inside were 32 pages of documents, school board minutes, letters from the superintendent, copies of arrest warrants, and a short trial transcript. All of it centered on Bolivar County, spring of 1889. The story came together in pieces. In March of that year, a white landowner named Peter Klein had visited a one-room schoolhouse on the edge of his property. The school served the children of black sharecroppers who worked his fields. Klein later testified that he had gone to check on the quality of instruction, concerned that the children were not being adequately prepared for agricultural labor. What he found, he claimed, shocked him. The teacher, Miss Viola Chandler, was conducting a lesson on grammar and essay composition. The children were reading from a primer that Klein did not recognize. When he asked to see the book, Chandler refused. Klein reported this to the county school board, which sent Superintendent Albert Griggs to inspect the school the following week. Griggs arrived unannounced. His report, typed on thin onion skin paper, was clinical and cold. He confiscated 17 books, all copies of the Freedmen's Literacy Primer. He also took several writing slates, student essays, and what he called seditious materials, though he did not specify what those were. He ordered the school closed immediately and summoned Chandler to appear before the county board. The trial transcript was only 4 pages long. Chandler was charged with violating the Manual Training Act and with conduct unbecoming an instructor of colored youth. She did not deny using the primer. According to the transcript, she said only that her students deserved to learn how to think, not just how to labor. She was fined $25, an amount that would have been nearly impossible for a black teacher to pay. The school was permanently closed. The property, which had been owned by a black church, was seized and sold to Peter Klein to cover court costs. Winters read the documents twice. Then she went back to the photograph. She looked at Viola Chandler's face, at the careful composure, the steady gaze. And she understood. The photograph had been taken 2 weeks before Griggs confiscated the materials. Chandler had known what was coming. Someone had warned her, or perhaps she had simply recognized the pattern. Other teachers in other counties had already been arrested. She knew the risk. And so she had gone to Isaiah Thorne's studio and paid $2. She probably could not afford to create a permanent record of what she was teaching and why it mattered. The slate in the photograph showed the same lesson, the same phrasing that would later be used as evidence against her. It was an act of defiance and an act of preservation. She had made sure that even if the school was closed and the books were burned, there would be proof that she had done this work. that her students had learned to write sentences like, "I will speak as I please." Winters sat in the research room for a long time after reading the file. Then she began the next phase of her work. She needed to understand the system that had made Viola Chandler's teaching illegal in the first place. Mississippi's Manual Training Act of 1887 had not emerged in a vacuum. It was part of a coordinated effort across the former Confederacy to dismantle the educational gains black communities had made during Reconstruction. Between 1865 and 1876, black Mississippians had built over 600 schools, many funded and operated entirely by black communities themselves. These schools taught classical subjects, literature, rhetoric, mathematics, history. They were modeled on the Northern Common School and on the educational traditions of free black communities before the war. White political leaders found this intolerable. By the mid-1880s, after federal troops had been withdrawn and Reconstruction governments had collapsed, Southern legislatures began passing laws to restrict black education. The rhetoric was always the same. Black children needed practical training for the work they would actually do, which meant agricultural and domestic labor. Academic education, lawmakers argued, would make them dissatisfied with their station and lead to social unrest. Mississippi's version of this policy was particularly strict. The 1887 Act not only banned certain textbooks, but also established a system of county-level inspections and gave white superintendents the authority to close schools and dismiss teachers at will. Black communities had no representation on school boards. Teachers were licensed by white officials who could revoke those licenses without formal cause. Winters traveled to Bolivar County to see what remained of the physical spaces connected to the photograph. The schoolhouse where Chandler had taught was long gone, plowed under decades ago when the land was consolidated into larger farms. But the church that had owned the property still stood, barely. It was a small clapboard building on a back road, its white paint grayed and peeling, surrounded by fields. A historical marker near the road mentioned the church's founding in 1871, but said nothing about the school. Inside, Winters met Reverend Thomas Clay, a retired minister in his 70s who had grown up in the area. He had heard stories about a teacher who had been arrested, though he did not know her name. There were a lot of those stories, he said. Teachers who got run off for teaching the wrong thing. It was not something people talked about openly, even later. It was dangerous to have been involved. Clay showed her the church's old membership ledger, kept in a metal box in a back room. Viola Chandler's name appeared in 1886, listed as a school teacher and church secretary. There were entries for several years, regular attendance recorded every Sunday. Then, in May of 1889, her name stopped appearing. There was no note explaining why. "What happened to her?" Winters asked. Clay did not know. A lot of people left after things like that, went north or moved to another county and changed their names. It was safer not to be remembered. Winters spent the next 2 weeks searching for Viola Chandler's trail. She checked census records, death certificates, marriage licenses, court documents. She found nothing. Chandler had disappeared from the public record entirely after the spring of 1889. Either she had left Mississippi, or she had died, or she had made herself invisible. But Winters did find something else. In the archives of a Black Baptist convention held in Memphis in 1891, there was a brief report on clandestine schools operating in the Delta region. The report did not name locations or teachers, but it described a network of educators who continued teaching classical literacy in secret, moving between homes and churches, using coded language to communicate lesson schedules. The report called it the quiet work and praised the courage of those involved. It estimated that at least 40 teachers were part of this network across 5 counties. Winters realized that Viola Chandler had not been working alone. The photograph, the deliberate staging of the slate, the precision of the lesson recorded there, all of it suggested coordination. A plan. Chandler had been part of a larger movement, a network of black teachers who had refused to accept the Manual Training Act as the final word on what their students deserved to learn. She found more evidence in fragments. A letter from a teacher in Sunflower County mentioned sharing materials from Virginia with colleagues. A church record from Coahoma County noted a donation to the Education Fund with no further explanation. A notice in a black newspaper from Vicksburg, dated 1888, advertised, "Tutoring services in advanced subjects, inquire discreetly." All of it pointed to the same conclusion. Black educators in Mississippi had built a covert system to continue teaching real literacy despite the legal prohibitions. They had created parallel schools, underground curriculums, and methods of protecting one another when the authorities came. The photograph was evidence of that system, and it had been kept in the files of a white superintendent, not as a trophy but as proof of a crime. It had been used to justify the closure of Chandler's school and the seizure of church property. And then it had sat in a box for over a century, labeled but never examined, its full meaning invisible to anyone who did not know what to look for. Winters drafted a proposal to the Historical Society's exhibition committee. She wanted to build a show around the photograph, not as a simple portrait of a teacher and student, but as a document of resistance. She wanted to tell the story of the Manual Training Act, the network of teachers who defied it, and the cost they paid. She wanted to name Viola Chandler and explain what she had been fighting for. The committee met on a Wednesday afternoon in June. Winters presented her findings: the trial transcript, the confiscated materials, the evidence of the secret teaching network, the legal history of educational suppression. She brought reproductions of the photograph, enlarged so the slate was clearly visible, and she walked the committee through every detail. The response was not what she expected. 3 members of the committee were enthusiastic, particularly the director of educational programming, who saw the potential for a major traveling exhibit. But 2 others, both longtime board members with deep family ties to the region, raised objections. One, a retired banker named Harold Fletcher, pointed out that Albert Griggs, the superintendent who had prosecuted Chandler, was his great-grandfather. "I am not comfortable with my ancestor being portrayed as a villain," he said. "He was doing his job. He was enforcing the law." Winters kept her voice even. "The law itself was unjust. That is the point." "That is your interpretation," Fletcher said, "and it is a political interpretation. We have donors who expect this institution to be neutral." The other board member, a woman named Caroline DeWitt, argued that the photograph was being taken out of context. "We do not actually know that Viola Chandler was part of some organized resistance network. You are speculating based on fragments. That is not scholarship. That is activism." Winters had anticipated some version of this argument, but it still stung. She pulled out the trial transcript and read aloud from Chandler's testimony. "My students deserve to learn how to think, not just how to labor." She held up the photograph. "This woman staged this image deliberately, knowing she would be prosecuted, so that there would be evidence of what she taught. That is not speculation. That is what the documents show." The meeting ended without a decision. The committee agreed to review Winters' proposal further and vote the following month. Winters left the building feeling exhausted and angry, but not surprised. She had worked in public history long enough to know that institutions were terrified of controversy, especially when that controversy implicated the ancestors of their donors. 2 weeks later, Dr. Marcus Webb called her with another lead. He had been contacted by a woman in Chicago named Lorraine Harper, who had seen a brief mention of Winters' research in an academic newsletter. Harper believed she might be related to Viola Chandler. Her great-great-grandmother had been a teacher in Mississippi who left the state suddenly in 1889 and never spoke about why. The family had always assumed it was because of violence or threats, but no one knew the details. Winters and Harper spoke on the phone for over an hour. Harper shared what little she knew. Her great-great-grandmother had arrived in Chicago in the summer of 1889 with almost no money and no possessions. She had worked as a seamstress for several years before eventually returning to teaching in the city's black schools. She had never gone back to Mississippi. She had never talked about her life there, even to her children. But she kept one thing, Harper said: a photograph. She kept it in a wooden box under her bed, and before she died, she told my great-grandmother to keep it safe. She said it was proof that she had done something that mattered. Winters felt her throat tighten. "Do you still have the photograph?" "I do," Harper said. "It is the same one you described, a teacher and a student at a desk. There is writing on a slate." It was the same image. Viola Chandler had kept a copy for herself. She had carried it north, preserved it, and made sure her descendants understood that it was important, even if they did not know the full story. Harper agreed to loan the photograph to the Historical Society for the exhibition. She also agreed to record an oral history about her great-great-grandmother's life in Chicago, the silence she had maintained about Mississippi, and the way that silence had shaped the family's understanding of their own history. The exhibition opened in October. It was called Proof: Black Teachers and the Fight for Literacy in Post-Reconstruction Mississippi. The centerpiece was the 1889 photograph, displayed beside an enlarged image of the slate and a wall text that explained every detail. Visitors could read the trial transcript, see the list of banned books, and learn about the Manual Training Act. There was a section on the underground teaching network illustrated with maps and documents. And there was a video interview with Lorraine Harper in which she spoke about discovering who her great-great-grandmother had really been and what she had risked. The response was immediate and divided. Black educators from across the state came to see the exhibition and brought their students. Teachers stood in front of the photograph and wept. Several said they had never known this history, had never been taught that their predecessors had faced arrest for teaching the same subjects they now taught freely. But there was also backlash. Local news outlets ran opinion pieces questioning whether the exhibition was too political. The Historical Society received letters from descendants of white families who felt their ancestors were being unfairly maligned. Harold Fletcher resigned from the board in protest, issuing a public statement that accused the society of abandoning neutrality in favor of a divisive agenda. Dr. Angela Winters did not apologize. In an interview with a regional newspaper, she said simply, "Viola Chandler broke the law because the law was designed to keep black children ignorant. She paid for that with her livelihood and possibly her freedom. The least we can do is tell the truth about what she did and why it mattered." The exhibition traveled to 3 other cities over the next 2 years. At each stop, researchers found new documents related to the underground teaching network: letters, lesson plans, coded messages. In one case, a descendant came forward with a primer that had been hidden in an attic for over a century, its pages carefully wrapped in cloth. It was the same edition that had been banned in 1887, the same text that Viola Chandler had used. On the inside cover, someone had written in pencil, "For those who come after." The photograph, once a piece of evidence used to prosecute a black teacher, had become evidence of something else entirely: a deliberate, organized, and courageous refusal to accept limits on what black children could learn. It was proof that literacy had been understood by both sides as a form of power, and that black educators had been willing to risk everything to claim that power for their students. Viola Chandler's final resting place was never found, but her image, that careful staging of defiance, remains. The slate in the photograph, with its 3 short sentences, has become an icon. It is reproduced in textbooks, displayed in classrooms, cited in dissertations. Educators across the country have painted those words on school murals. "I write my name with care. I read from books made for thinking. I will speak as I please." Old photographs like this one are everywhere. They fill archives, museum basements, family albums. Most of them seem straightforward: portraits of teachers and students, workers and families, communities and institutions. They are treated as simple documents of daily life, evidence of how people dressed and where they lived. But they are never neutral. Every photograph is a choice. Someone decided what to include, what to exclude, how to pose the subjects, what objects to display. And in the decades after slavery, in the brutal years when black communities fought to hold on to the gains of emancipation while white authorities worked to take them away, those choices often carried meanings that were deliberately hidden from white viewers, but legible to those who knew how to look. There are other photographs like Viola Chandler's, images of children standing in schoolyards with books clutched just a little too tightly. Portraits of families where one member holds an object that seems ordinary but meant something specific. Pictures of church groups where hands are positioned in gestures that were part of a coded system of recognition and trust. These images are still waiting in boxes, still mislabeled, still reduced to decoration or curiosity. They are waiting for someone to look closely, to ask the right questions, to refuse the easy explanation. Because every one of them is proof that resistance was real, organized, and deliberate. That people who were told they had no right to think found ways to teach their children to think anyway. That courage was not just dramatic in public, but also quiet and persistent and passed down through generations in the form of a hidden primer, a coded message, a photograph staged just so. And that every time we walk past one of these images without seeing what is really there, we are continuing the work that people like Albert Griggs began, making sure that defiance stays buried, that resistance is forgotten, that the people who fought hardest for the future are erased from the past. Viola Chandler's Slate tells us otherwise. It tells us that some truths refuse to stay hidden, no matter how long they are kept in boxes, no matter how carefully they are mislabeled. And it tells us that if we are willing to look closely, to sit with an image until its secrets become clear, we might finally see the people who were always there, refusing to be made invisible, insisting on being remembered for what they were. Not victims, but fighters who knew exactly what they were fighting for.